Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Evelina. Glad to be back together doing this again. We've had a few
Yeah,
immediately, haven't we?
likewise. So hello, welcome to everyone who's listening. And those are our weekly live conversations where we address variety of topics behind the closed doors. And I think this is probably episode of 52 of Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and this time we are discussing a very sensitive topic. So there's a little bit of a warning. And in preparation of a World Suicide Prevention Day on Sunday, 10th of September, we wanted to dive in deeper into how exactly do we have those sensitive, vulnerable conversations with people at risk. And when we talk about those conversations, there's a lot of things that often are not being talked about. So, for example, what happens once you refer people to emergency service? How do you support yourself while you're having conversations with people at risk? What are what are things that we sometimes do and say that can increase person's risk, which again we often don't talk about. And yeah, we want to give you a very clear framework that you can walk away from the session with, to take with you, to enable you to have those conversations in a way that protects you and other people there as well.
Absolutely. So we kind of want to give you these tips and just a bit of a framework so that you can feel comfortable and confident going into those conversations. But we'll also mention some trainers that we recommend if you do want to go deeper into that. And understandably, you may feel that there's additional resources that you might want to draw on as well following this.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, talking about vulnerability, I have to say that the first time in my life I'm doing this live with no makeup, with no jewelry on. So I do also feel a little bit vulnerable and naked. So I thought, for this topic, to make sure that we are really in this, it may be the right time to do this. So if you can't recognize me, it's still me.
Still you, don't worry.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So welcome for those who are just tuning in. Please feel free to ask us any questions. We would like to make this as safe place as possible. We would love for you to ask any questions. We will share some resources and contacts with you to reach out for support, but also, just as a bit of warning before we start diving deeper, we will share some quite open, vulnerable information. And if at any point you feel triggered by any of that, or you feel like conversation is not going where you feel comfortable to listen to, feel free to step away from that. And we are both open for you to reach out to us personally, to have those conversations in person, virtually, in whatever way that we can help and support. So just extending that message there before we start diving into that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, naturally, the suicide is something that has actually probably affected more of us, even directly or indirectly, than we realize. So do be kind to yourself and kind of take time if it feels like this is too much. In the UK, unfortunately, 120 people die by suicide every week. And so we were really aware of kind of the prevalence of that issue and that topic and that experience in everyone's lives.
Yeah. And also, just to share, why I'm, for example, working in this field and why suicide is close to my heart. And I'm originally from Lithuania, and I don't know if you know, but Lithuania has the highest suicide rates in entire Europe and one of the highest suicide rates in the world. So to compare the statistics, the way how suicide prevalence is measured, it's usually assessed by the number of people per 10,000 of population. In UK, that number over years fluctuates between, let's say, 7 and the maximum has been like 7 and 9 and so on. In Lithuania, that number is close to 30. So just to illustrate the severity of that. And I personally know 7 people who took their own lives. I have attended some funerals and had some sensitive conversations with people in my life about this. And therefore, for me, I think it provides this great source of motivation to do something about it. It's one of those causes that I cannot not do something about this. And of course, it's the work that we are doing. We are not running a suicide prevention organization, right? It's also important for you to know that what we do is 10 steps before that. We look at creating supportive environments, giving people right tools to look after themselves and support their loved ones, creating right conditions and working environments for people at work, so you never even get to that place, and also being involved in research and social policy to shape the society to make sure that we have more supportive working environments. So so this is just kind of a personal message for me, and I think it is so important that we don't wait until we are touched by this personally until we take action. And this is what I see over and over again, that people are very ignorant about this cause until we are personally touched by this. But then it's too late, right? And for me, the biggest sign, the warning sign that we have for kind of the severity of the situation and how uneducated we are as a society about suicide, is the fact that we always say, oh, this suicide came from nowhere. There were no any warning signs, right? And I know it might sound harsh, and for some people it might be really hard to hear. If you have loved ones who taken their own lives and you could not do anything about it, you did not know anything about this message can be very hard to hear. But there are always signs. And the fact that we don't know them and we don't recognize them as a society is not your fault. And it's not your fault that you couldn't help that person. It's just a sign that us as a society, we are not prepared for this, to the point that we are not able to see those signs. And this is, I think, the big message that we would like to share. I know, of course, there's all these debates, can all suicides be prevented or not? For us who are working in this health and well-being space, we have to believe that all suicides can be preventable. Obviously, reality is very different. When you go into one-to-one settings, there are situations where you should not feel like you have to change this and it's entirely in your hands. But in the bigger picture, we believe that all suicides are preventable if we only know how to intervene, if we only know how to support, but also, most importantly, if we take those 10 steps back and look at why this person here in a first place, how did they got to this situation? And what I'd like to look at through this conversation is that we see we see suicide as a problem in a society, right? But on the individual level, what is important to recognize that suicide for that person is a solution. And that's, I think, very important message to take, because if we have this outlook that, if suicide is the only solution available, is the best solution for this person right here and right now, what is the problem that they're dealing with? That this is their best option. This is their best way out, right? And once we start looking at it from this perspective, then I think we have a very different mindset, because now we are less scared to talk about the suicide itself, we are much more prepared to look at this human conversation and what's beyond the surface, and like, how did you get here, and what is it that could be done, and what are the steps and actions that could be taken, so that person recovers that bit of hope and recovers that bit of um, ability to see that there are some other options, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is kind of where it might be important to say that we'll kind of cover briefly, but also link to some resources to talk about how to notice some of those warning signs in others. So you may, I think a lot of the time people wonder whether it's the right time to ask, is it the right time to have the conversation? Because we often don't want to. So we often don't want to have that conversation, and because there's a sense of taboo around it, but there's also this concern that sometimes that we might give someone the idea. We're never going to give someone the idea of suicide, but also that it might seem dramatic or over the top, and that they'll say, "What are you talking about?" And I'm definitely not thinking about suicide. And then we'll feel like, "Oh, that was a silly thing to ask." But actually, asking is not embarrassing. It's not giving anyone the idea. It's showing that you care. So
And
even
it's
if that
and it's validating that person's experience. If they are experiencing this, just by simply asking, it really makes them feel heard and seen, and it gives them permission to talk about those things.
Absolutely, exactly. So it's an invitation, not necessarily to say, yes, I am feeling suicidal, but at least to comment on and open up a conversation about, say, what is it that is giving that impression? So you might have noticed a change in their behavior. They might be feeling more hopeless, or talking about not having any purpose, or feeling trapped, or wanting to die, or wanting things to end, or struggling to just stay alive and keep going. You might also notice things kind of there are changes in their behavior in terms of taking more risk-taking behavior, or even things like trying to wrap things up in their life, organize, tie up loose ends, withdrawing from social situations, sleeping more or less, eating more or less, taking alcohol or drugs more than usual. So things like that, often those signs, as individuals and in certain contexts, you would not read those as potential warning signs for suicide, but they can be. And so to open up a conversation, even if that person doesn't necessarily want to talk about suicide, or they're not thinking about it, you're still opening up a conversation about something that may be going on for them, that you still may well be preventing suicide that could develop further down the line. So I think that's
Yeah, absolutely. And the way we pre-frame those conversations, and the way we invite people to have those conversations. Of course, not everyone is feeling comfortable and confident to have this, but only because we've never been given skills and tools to be able to do that safely. So we really hope that at the end of the session, you will feel like you have that bit where of the toolkit in your back pocket that you can always use and be comfortable with this. Now, it doesn't mean that, of course, anytime you see someone behaving somehow differently to what they usually do, you would just jump in and straight away start with, oh, are you having any suicidal thoughts, or are you planning to kill yourself, right? But there are ways how we can encourage, when we're observing people around us, and when we see some of the slight nuances and differences in their behavior, we'll usually have this kind of gut sense that something is not right here. I don't know what, I cannot put the finger on it, but most of the time we feel that, right? And that's the moment where we can start building the rapport with that person, and to really try create those intimate personal moments where you can just sit somewhere quietly in a safe space and just say, how are you? I'm fine. No, how are you really? Like, what's happening for you? And I think this big part of this British culture, where we are really hiding how we're really feeling. Everyone's always fine, everything's always okay, nothing is, it's not bad, and we are really throwing away those labels, where actually there is a whole sea of emotions, beyond that surface, and we don't show that turmoil to anyone else, right? So how can you kind of pierce through that? How can you go through this superficial barrier and allow people to have those conversations? And I'd love to see some of their comments. Good afternoon, Lucy. Hello everyone who's joining and listening in. We'd love to hear, what do you think? What are the best ways to actually overcome this barrier of kind of stiff upper lip British culture where everything's fine, and you can enable those more open conversations? And one simple way of doing this is actually asking people very specific questions. So instead of saying, how are you, which is a huge question, right, in a way, and maybe that's why people are not answering it specifically, be very, very precise and specific. How did you sleep tonight? What did you have for breakfast, Valentina? How was your yesterday evening? What are you working on today? What are you excited today about? Oh, you look a bit more tired than usual. Just observe feedback. It's like, oh, maybe there are some changes in their appearance. You look more tired, you look whatever that might be. It's okay to ask, right? And sometimes we make assumptions that are not correct, and say, oh, you look tired, and the person will say, oh really? No, I feel great, right? And I've done that, but it's better you ask that, then you will live in a place where a person is feeling crap and they haven't slept and they haven't eaten for days, and no one haven't even noticed and acknowledged that something is not right for this person, something is going for them. So I think just starting with those very specific little conversations and just practice them with your colleagues, with your friends. Be specific. How was your day? What's your breakfast? Be specific and get to know them, and therefore that just builds that bit of trust to have more of those open conversations.
Absolutely. And I think with that as well, it's important to recognize that if somebody doesn't want to talk about something, they can always say no. But sometimes they'll need the invitation to step outside of a comfort zone where they might feel inhibited, but actually they need that signal that you're willing to listen. If you've noticed that maybe there's some things going on in their life, they might have a recent relationship loss or job loss or something happening with their family, anything going on, ask specifically about it. And you can always caveat that with no pressure to answer if you don't want to. I just want to check in and see how you're feeling about this.
That's right. And it's just right, Valentina. I'm glad you're acknowledging the fact that, again, it's so important to put power in other person's hand, right? It's up to you how much you want to share and how far you want to go. And therefore, before you start any of that conversation, you say, look, we can stop this anytime. You share as much as you want, and it's absolutely up to you to share as much or as little as you want. Absolutely. Yeah. So looking at those warning signs, and again, maybe people want to comment in a chat as well. What are some of those kind of less known signs that we should be watching out for? And one that I would say is very important and often being overlooked is a financial situation of the person. And now we know that men are more likely to die by suicide than women. Part of this reason is because simply men use different means to do this that are just much more just much more harsher in that way. But also there is other thing that comes from this culture of men not talking about emotions, men not being allowed to share their concerns. And there is a huge stigma that is not being talked about, is actually we expect men to be financial providers. And it is not acceptable for men to raise their hand and say, you know what, I'm struggling, something is happening here. And we are really missing a lot of those conversations, and financial reasons where a person finds themselves in a situation where they feel they can't get out of, or, again, looking at, peaks and suicides will always coincide with the financial crisis, right? Because people's financial situations will be affected. And And it's so important that we recognize this, and especially at the moment now where we are in quite difficult economic situation, and we talk about the cost of living crisis and so on. We should not underestimate the impact of financials and monetary situation on people's ability to be in control of their own lives.
Absolutely. And I think that that's kind of also points to this feeling of trappedness that can really encourage or kind of be a sign for in a state where someone might be experiencing thoughts of suicide is, when we feel financially at threat and unable to support ourselves, support others, there can be a state of feeling trapped, like there isn't another option, that we kind of can't address this quickly and easily. And I think that's really important to highlight as well, those additional pressures kind of culturally that have been on men. And I think that even more so influence the way or the inhibitions around talking about these things. Kind of as part of our research, we look at what kinds of topics people are able and feel more able to talk to their immediate social circle about. And financial concerns is one that people more often than not feel less able to talk about. And I think that's really important to recognize. And we want to normalize talking about those stresses and, between women and women, but also men and men. And I think it's also really important here to recognize that when, especially for another man, to have a man ask that question, how are you doing about this, or even directly, if it gets to that point, are you having thoughts of suicide? Some of the things that you're saying and doing might lead someone to believe that you are thinking about suicide. So I just want to ask if you are. That not only kind of dispels then the idea that you kind of can't talk about it, because this man has now just shown, well, I'm willing to talk about it. I'm inviting you in as a man to talk about it. And it kind of breaks that sense of isolation. And it means that there's, that has knock-on effects for then conversations that can be had among men more widely. So I think kind of, I just really, really encourage any men who are watching and listening to this to see this as something where you have a lot of power also by being in the more.
And we have to lead that change. We have to role model this. And I personally had the experience where I have posted a message in the community that I'm part of that has some quite influential people working in financial space. And when they were affected by different kind of financial crisis, collapse of different economic financial systems and so on, I made that note saying, if anybody is not feeling okay about this, if anyone wants to speak about this, we need to open up and address the fact that to some people this will cost lives, and we have to talk about this. And I made a post about this, and there were some people who are very vocal in that community about let's have help, let's have support, let's support each other through this financial crisis. And I made a post, and I made a post about loss of lives because of this and the potential suicides. And I tagged some of those leaders in that post who were very vocal about that financial crisis and support, and they all untagged themselves from it. And when I posted the message in a closed community, no one interacted with it, but I have received personal messages from a few people saying thank you. And there was somebody as well sharing with me that they have lost a friend at the back of 2008 financial crisis, and it's they thanked me for what I'm doing, and yet that person would still not interact publicly, right? So for me, this is like a huge sign of a stigma that we have, that it's all very well to say I'm the strong, powerful person and I'm going to support you, everyone. Oh yeah, but don't talk to me about suicide, right? So we really need to pull those barriers down, and we need to role model those conversations. So Lucy is making a comment here saying, I come up against this a lot and do struggle with an answer. Do you want to elaborate specifically about what would you like us to answer here? So to help you, I'm not entirely sure what exactly you're referring to in our conversation here. Yeah, so I think that's important. And if we're looking at what is really suicide, and of course we can always look at the list of those signs and all these warning hazard lights that we would look in people, right? But if we just kind of walk away with the message that suicide is a loss of hope and loss of options, where people feel like they are stuck in a situation, whatever that is, and there is no way out. And it is actually suicide then feels like their only solution to it, right? If we take that as a kind of our definition of suicide, then we are much more open to see different other signs that you might not find in the list of your usual definitions of the signs to watch out for, but that for this person, this is a sign of loss of hope. For this person, and the way I know them and the way they speak to me, I now can recognize that they don't see any other option. They don't have options. They feel stuck, right? And that's always a risky situation. So, yeah. So what we can do now, let's move on to kind of talking you through the steps of the clamp model, which is a framework that we have created to enable anyone to have those conversations safely. Before we go into each of those steps one by one, we would like to also very quickly address some of the things what we should not do and should not say, right? Because it's very easy to say do this and do that, but actually by simply not doing something, even if you don't know what is the right thing to do, just by having in mind some things not to do and not to say, you can already have a much greater impact and have much greater support. So, Valentina, what are some of the list of things that we should not do and should not say when we are having conversations with vulnerable people?
So often, we really want to help. We really, really want to do our best to fix this problem for someone. Someone might be explaining a problem or a difficult emotion, and our instinctive desire is to find a solution, offer a solution, and therefore we end up giving advice. Giving advice is not what this person needs at this point. It can be disempowering and it can feel unempathetic. So that we want that person to feel heard and understood, and asking questions to understand is generally better than offering advice. It can also lead to feelings of inadequacy. If someone either has done that thing or hasn't done that thing and it's not worked, then it can kind of reflect on the individual rather than the circumstance and actually worsen things.
And if we think that, again, that situation for them is loss of hope and it's actually loss of power, right? They feel that there's nothing I can do, there's nothing in my control, right? And sometimes the act of suicide is a process of regaining control. That's, my life is the only thing that is in control right now. And that's their way of acting that control out because they feel completely overwhelmed by everything else, right? So the moment you start telling people what to do, you are overwhelming with all of these things because they don't believe that they can. They don't believe that they can do anything. And therefore, we are adding to their sense of hopelessness. So sometimes some of those suggestions come from the best place, but we should never, ever make any suggestions. And this applies actually overall mental health conversations, right? People with lived experiences very often jump in and say, oh, you should do this and you should do that. But actually, just because that helped you, that might make other person worse. You don't know that, right? So there are ways of saying, have you tried this? And have you thought of this? And it's, you are just asking them if they tried and so on. And then therefore it's up to them to engage with that. But we never tell them what to do and, avoiding words like you should, or you have to, or do this. That's an absolute biggest no for those kind of conversations.
Absolutely. And kind of with that as well comes, I think, when we're worried that someone's thinking about suicide and might act on that, we want to tell them not to. And that's really understandable as well. That also comes from a place of empathy. It might really go against your instinct, but don't tell someone not to do what they're thinking. It shows a lack of empathy, like real empathy, really understanding where they're at. And also it reinforces this this feeling of, I can't talk about this. I can't share that I want to do this, because immediately as soon as I do, I get, well, don't do that. That's a bad idea. That's not the right thing to do. Actually, again, you know, allowing someone to feel that way, you know, because it's also important to recognize that experiencing suicidal thoughts doesn't always lead to, there's actually a very long period of suicide ideation. So thinking about it.
It's a whole continuum, right? From somebody just having thoughts to really going out to that place where they're ready to take action. And we'll talk about that in that model.
Yeah.
The other bit that I think is very important to address here, building on what Valentina just said, is not telling them all these wonderful things that they have in life, right? And sometimes when somebody shares how they feel, and you know, that could be about not wanting to live anymore, but it also could be about, you know, some other difficult feelings and emotions, and people start telling them often like, oh, but you know, but you have this amazing job that everybody dreams of. Oh, but you have family, but you have money. It's like, what else? Like, look at all these good things you have in life, right? Do you think they don't know that? They know that. But the fact that those things do not feel like it's a source of happiness, motivation in any way, and most of the time, person in that desperate situation usually feels like a burden. They feel like they're not needed anymore, and they genuinely believe that their family and loved ones would be better off without them. And obviously, this is quite a distorted thinking, but generally people feel like this. So therefore, you highlighting them those things again make them feel worse, because now they feel like, oh, you know, I
Grateful.
shouldn't be feeling this way. I shouldn't be feeling this way. So now they, instead of feeling bad, now they are also feeling bad about feeling bad. And it adds these layers of emotions that really uh, leads them to sinking in deeper and deeper into that hole. So yeah, we should not be telling them what to do. We should not be telling all these wonderful things that they have. We should not be also telling them about other people and kind of like nearly like gaslighting, but like, you know, how will your family, your children will feel if you leave them, right? But because this conversation here and now, it's not about their children, their loved ones and so on. It's about them, right? So we really, really need to kind of stop gaslighting that person into kind of for, you know, blaming them for feeling how they feel, as if they have no right to feel this way, right? So I think some of those things, these are kind of common things. We jump in with solutions. We want to show the bright side, and this is just the best that we want to do, right? But in reality, in that situation, we make people feel worse because of that.
Absolutely. And kind of we'll go into explaining our model, because I know we can't cover everything in the context, but I've just popped a link in the chat. Hopefully that will appear in kind of on LinkedIn and YouTube as well, but I'll make sure that it's on there afterwards as well if it's not there. But it's to a really useful organization. They do training, but they also kind of professional training and training for individuals. But they also have a very useful suicide prevention hub that has lots of statistics, myths, kind of causes, warning signs, real stories. There's a interactive film and training courses. So very, very much worthwhile looking into that. And it's kind of a model, they use a model that's quite similar to what we're using here. So it kind of really aligns with our approach. The other thing I also just wanted to mention, and I'll post a link to as well, kind of before we get into our model, is the Stay Alive app. That is an app created by the same organization. And it can be really useful resource if you want to have a conversation, but maybe you've forgotten everything that you've researched and had training for, because you're in the moment and it's nerve-wracking. The Stay Alive app can be a really useful guide to kind of help work through some of those things. And for anyone who feels at risk of suicide themselves, or they have a close loved one, I'd really recommend downloading it, even just having it on your phone so it's ready. You can have a browse, look at the information on there. Very beneficial.
Absolutely. Some other resources. So, these are, kind of less known resources. And then, of course, we have, Samaritan's Line, we have Shout messaging line, we have Zero Suicide Alliance that do a lot of support and workshops as well. And also Hub of Hope. So those are sources that we can go for more information and refer other people for support. So we'll share all of those resources. Before we dive into the model and the process, just want to address the question that Lucy is having here. So so I'm a counselor and clients are struggling financially. I want to offer them a solution. I find it frustrating just listening is not enough. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for anyone who works in kind of people helping spaces, we recognize that we cannot be able, we can't help them with everything. And therefore, as a specialist in specific field, that we all have limitations on what we can do and what we cannot. And therefore, Lucy, what we would recommend is actually building partnerships with people who can provide alternative services for which you cannot cater for. And in Elite Mind Academy, we have range of professionals with variety of subject areas of expertise, and we facilitate those networks. So, if we have somebody who's focusing on finances, somebody who's focusing on nutrition, somebody who's focusing on relationships, somebody who's focusing on, clinical medication and so on, you have the range of professionals that you say, I'm expert in this, but actually I don't have to be taking responsibility for everything else and try to help people with things that I'm not an expert with. So there are financial well-being support, there are financial advisors who are offering free support as well to help people to get out of those situations. So please do reach out to us. We're more than happy to put you in touch and add you to our network, so you can tap into those wonderful professionals. And I think it's so important to have that support network, so we don't feel like we have to carry through our own. And again, at the end of the day, if as a counselor, as a therapist, it is not your responsibility to solve person's financial issues. However, they came you for help, maybe because they're feeling like this because of those financial issues, right? So it's of course very related, and we have to be able to address that and have those networks with, especially if you see common threads, right? If you see that people are coming to you with some commonalities of, specific problem or specific resource, establish those partnerships and resources with other professionals in the field, so you can refer them to them, and you build on them and say, oh, by the way, I will also refer you to this person for this financial advice. So it could be really, really valuable way of kind of supporting yourself as well as adding additional value through your service to that person and help them to get out of that situation faster. So we hope that helps. All right, so let's get to that clamp model. So clamp model. So each letter stands for a step in the process that we should follow while we're having those conversations. And C is for comfort. And this is a very, very basic first step that is often really underestimated, because we want to just go into those conversations, but we never address the whole framework of, when to do this, how to do this, is this the right time to do this? And what is important, that if somebody comes to you for the conversation, we actually have to ask, are you okay to speak about this now? Is it okay for us to have it here? Is there an alternative time, space, place when you are feeling better to do this? And we have to absolutely give that person permission that they feel in a safe space, and it is the right time for them to have this conversation. But the other important point is that the same applies to you as a listener, because very often somebody would come to you with something like, emotional state, or especially at work, for example, you might be working through something and some emotional person comes in and is like, I need to speak to you now, right? It's also very important that you also plan for this and you resource yourself emotionally, and you are also in that physical space where you feel comfortable, safe, and you have that confidential space to have that conversation. So this state of comfort relates to physical comfort, making sure that the person is, maybe has a drink, sitting comfortably. Maybe they are in that physically calm and relaxed space. So we can have that conversation, and it applies both to the listener as well as the person who is receiving support there.
Absolutely. I mean, just to kind of reiterate that, it really does set the tone for also what you're able to achieve in that conversation. So really kind of setting the scene, so that everyone does feel comfortable and emotionally safe is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to ask us any questions in each of those steps. We'll try to give you questions as much as we can to ask in each of those steps. And the second step is here, listen. So obviously talking about all of these other things, what not to do and what to say, taking that into account. We don't make any judgments. We don't make any, we don't tell them what to do. We don't highlight all of these wonderful things that are happening in their life. We really don't direct them in any way at that stage. We just really want to have this empathetic listening hat and just be there for them and just create this safe holding space. And we just want to ask questions that allows them to open up. So imagine if you take that person as a Wikipedia page, right? Whatever they say, you say, oh, I'll click on this word to open a next page so I can look deeper and deeper and deeper, right? So you can always look at what that person said. So what about this? And can you tell me more about this? So you say that it's that. How is that? So, this very simple things. If you say like, oh, things are difficult, you can repeat even the same question, the same statement to them in a form of a question, right? So if somebody says things are difficult, you can say things are difficult, and you're iterating difficult, which means now you're inviting them to talk about emotions. Or you will say things are difficult. What specific things? And now you are inviting them to talk about circumstances and things that they're dealing with, right? So take it as you are kind of clicking on those specific words that person is giving you to dive in deeper and to understand, a little bit more, and, ask, just ask them a little bit more questions to allow them, just be curious, right? Just be curious about what is this experience that they're going through, and just have this safe holding space where you just allow them to open up and share whatever they need to share without you kind of intervening with their thought process too much, right? Just allow them to build on whatever they need to build.
Absolutely. And I think a really important kind of word that you said that is a useful takeaway is just non-judgmental. Really, it's you're coming into this with no judgment. You're even just be careful of your facial expressions and your body language. As someone who is very expressive in my facial expressions, it's something that I have to be aware of in those kinds of circumstances, to just not show if you have if you're feeling shocked or if you have a negative judgment on something. It's important to make sure that that doesn't kind of reflect and come across. And I think it's also to be aware when you are asking those questions to kind of go deeper. Also, kind of, we don't necessarily need, want someone to, you may not be a counseling professional or a therapeutic professional. And so it's not your job to get to the heart of the matter and to really get them to explain in more and more nuanced and detailed ways how bad they're feeling, because that can kind of encourage them to kind of go down in that hole. So just have a slight boundary with that. You want to explore and get a picture of the issues, but you don't need to kind of direct them down into that emotion too strongly. You can also notice if they do mention any protective factors or protective emotions even. So something that they might have felt good about, or something that they might mention looking forward to, or that they were looking forward to. Anything that you notice that might be protective, asking questions about that as a balance as well to
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we often don't know what to do and what to say as the first thing when somebody shares that, oh, I don't want to live, or maybe, I think I'm depressed, or I think, something else is happening there, right? The first thing that you can do is just to thank them, right? Just say, thank you for sharing this with me. And that is the all validation that they need, that they feel safe to share this with you. And I don't know how about you, Valentina. I'm sure you're feeling the same. But doing this kind of work where you are hearing people's secrets and the most vulnerable things, and all of their emotions and experiences they have never shared with anyone, it feels a privilege to be invited in that person's vulnerable space and be part of their journey. So take that as a privilege that they have shared that with you. They put all of their trust in you, and to acknowledge that, just thank them. And that usually opens up quite a nice space to then build on. And as you say thank you, and you say like, I'm really touched that you're sharing this with me, you can just be silent, right? They will share next whatever they feel they want to share next with you, right? So yeah, so just that for the listening stage, I guess. The next step is assessing. So now, of course, we are not necessarily looking at this from kind of like clinical medical point of view. We don't want to diagnose them. We don't want to label them. What we are assessing, we are actually assessing the situation of the person. We are assessing their level of severity of risk, and we are assessing the resources that they already have available and their coping mechanisms, so we know how to gauge the support that they might need, and what would be the next actions to take. So what is it exactly that we're assessing? So if we're assessing from suicide point of risk, like Valentina mentioned before, there is a huge range, there's a huge gap between person just having a thought and person actually having made a plan and have means and resources to go and execute this thing, right? So we need to kind of take through those steps from just having a thought and saying, are you thinking about killing yourself? So we always start conversation at that kind of superficial layer, and then we dig deeper and we ask, okay, have you thought of how you would do it? And we would then build on, okay, do you then actually have access to this? Do you have access to those resources? Did you think of when would you do this? And it is okay to ask those questions and just being curious and just acknowledging and understanding. And the moment, that the biggest risk is when person has made a plan, has a date, and has access to the means, right? And the first thing that we want to do is to then make sure that we remove the access to the means for them, right? So we need to be assessing this level of risk, because that will then influence what next needs to happen in that conversation for us with that individual. And it is, again, it's just having that benchmark of understanding the stages of the planning process that person goes through, from that kind of suicidal risk. There's also another big myth to address here, is that it's often believed that suicidal ideation is a consequence of mental illness. Very often it is not. It can be, but often it is not. And like we mentioned, for example, financial difficulties, we might have some other life situations out of which we don't feel like we have a way out. And that will create suicidal thoughts for us, right? To the point that if it carries on for too long, we will go down the road until we end up planning it and executing it, right? So it's not always mental health issue. Therefore, we should not be kind of assessing the level of mental illness, right? We are really just assessing the risk of this individual of taking that step and taking that action, and how far are they on that planning scale of doing this, so you know the level of risk there.
Absolutely. And then that can inform what can come next in terms of initiating or trying to kind of identify from them steps that they might take to protect themselves, but also if there are additional steps that you might need to take as an individual supporting here in this circumstance as well.
Yeah. Which goes to the next point of motivating them to take action. Now, this part is always missing from the most training and most guidance that we see from suicide prevention advice and training, because we'll say, well, you're not professional, therefore you cannot help them in any way. Your role is just to listen and signpost them to the resources. We place this point very strategically here, because if you think about this, what this person is missing here is hope, and what they lack is sense of agency, that they can actually do something else, something different about the situation. Motivating them to take action and showing them that there might be different options, there might be different choices, might be just enough for them not to go and carry out that act, right? So this is a very, very important to know that this is the most powerful thing that each and every one of us can do to shift that person from hopelessness to a place of hope, which will stop them in the tracks of whatever they were about to do. Okay. So how do we do this? Now, we want to ask people about their coping mechanisms, right? We want to equip them with self-awareness about the triggers, the circumstances, and what helps them, what hinders them, right? So we want to unpack the situation and say, okay, so when specifically do you feel X, based on whatever they shared with you? What makes the situation worse? What makes the situation better, right? What are specific triggers that really gets you into that kind of state? Are you aware of that? Okay. Can we explore that? Let's see. Let's observe. What can we do to then, which of those triggers are actually in your control and what is out of your control? So if it's out of your control, we have to learn to let go. If it's in your control, what is it that we can do? And what is that first step that you can take to do this, right? So there are a lot of now, and this bit is all about asking open questions and asking coaching questions, right? So you're looking at their coping mechanisms. You're looking at resources you have. Who else is out there that you could speak about this? Have you thought of X? Have you tried X? What worked about this? What didn't work? Why? What other things do you feel are there that we might be able to explore? And by the way, can we try to look at whole this situation from the different perspective? What if you try to step out of your own shoes, stand out of your own seat, and if you would be other person, what advice would you give to yourself, right? So there's all of these different things that can allow people to shift their perspective out of this state of stuckness into the place of ownership, where they are actually just inspired to take that tiny little step of motivation to just do smallest thing that is in their control. Because the moment they realize that there is even a tiniest thing that they can do and it's in their control, that hopelessness, that state of hopelessness disappears, right? Obviously it's not such a quick process, but sometimes one session of this good conversation can really completely reunite hope in that person. right?
Absolutely. Never underestimate the power of kind of, and how empowering it can be to support someone to recognize that they have options. And in the case of suicide, when I kind of said, you don't want to tell them not to do it, you're framing suicide as an option.
Yes.
Suicide is an option. And let's look at some
Other
other
options.
options. And it's then down to that person to look at these other options and hopefully decide, while suicide is an option, actually maybe we've revealed that there's another option that I might want to try first.
Absolutely. I'll refer to one of the conversations, and Valentina, you will know Stephen Gilligan, with whom we've both trained, who's one of the greatest psychotherapists on earth, who's been trained by Milton Erickson, and he's doing a lot of trance work, a lot of deep psychotherapy work. And I had a privilege of observing him coaching someone live, and that person shared with them that they don't want to live. And the response from Stephen was, how is that a problem for you? And this might sound very strange, but actually, when you look at, so, to what extent the fact that you don't want to live is a problem to you? How exactly does that manifest in your life, in your thought processes, in your behaviors? And what you end up looking at, that actually the fact that you want to die might not necessarily be a problem. It's a problem in their own different unique ways, which will give you opportunities to look deeper at some of the solutions for that. But also, what it allows is to allows us to extract or kind of explore those different parts of ourselves, right? Because you might want to feel like, you know what, the real problem is not that I don't want to live. The real problem is that this part of me doesn't want to live and this other part does. So here's internal conflict, right? And when we resolve that internal conflict, then the state of that kind of hopelessness and confusion, is being resolved. That inner conflict is resolved, which is also part of therapeutic process. So obviously here I'm just giving a little bit more information, maybe for people who are working in that therapeutic setting, to have those kind of deeper conversations from the different angles. So that doesn't mean that, you need to go into those kind of depth of the questions if you don't have that therapeutic area of expertise. But I'm aware that some of the people who are here are counselors and so on. So that might be an interesting insight for you to take into your own work.
Absolutely. And it's kind of part of that recognizing protective factors as well. So if we can identify the part of that person that does want to live, that might elucidate then some of these other protective factors and motivators for taking that step. That will be that first step to minimize their risk and recognize other options.
Absolutely, which leads us to the last point, which is protect, but that also can be plan and provide resources, right? So depending on our level of assessment that we do, we will know what is it that we need to do here. And we need to make a plan to protect this person in the best way that we can. And we provide them relevant support and resources for them to go back to that place of safety, recovery, and hope. So what are the different ways that we can do this? And the most common things that we are seeing that, we are being told just to refer people to external services, right? And there are different levels of support for that, right? So we say, okay, if you just feel like you need to have a conversation, here is your Samaritan's number, here is your Shout text number, here is so on. But what this means that we are now placing an agency. Well, we are telling a person who doesn't have agency to do something. How likely do you think they are going to do this? Right? And I think this is also a very important message to take, that we keep telling people, please reach out, please speak up. No, it's not enough to tell people to reach out, because they are in that place where they feel hopeless. They don't feel like there is anything they can do. They don't feel like anyone can help them. And when you are feeling like that, it is incredibly difficult to reach out for that help. And many, many people don't. So it's not good enough to reach out, to tell them to reach out. We need to reach in. right? So what can we do to protect this person? And here, what do we want to do? We want to make a plan to protect this person, and we want to extract all the information that we can do. So if we, throughout the conversation, we looked at some risks and triggers, we want to say, okay, what's the plan that we can put in place? So you are keeping some of those triggers away. What is the plan for who you can reach out to if you feel this way? What is the plan to keep yourself away from that medicine cupboard or a gun or whatever that is, to protect yourself from this, right? So you can really make that plan with that person. So they have that sense of agency, they have that sense of control, and they know that there are some other different options available. And also, the most common, this kind of, from medical and confidentiality act, from medical professionals, we're always being told that the moment you realize that the person is at risk and they are at that kind of emergency case state where they have a plan, they have a date, and so on, you don't let them go anywhere and you call emergency services. Now, me and Valentina, we don't fully agree with that, because working in this field and being involved in this, we know that sometimes it creates more risks, and actually it increases chances of that person taking their own life than if you haven't had done that. Now, of course, this means that there's a huge responsibility on your shoulders to make that decision, right? Whether you feel that referring them to that emergency support will break that trust that you've just established with them throughout that relationship, and whether this will be good for them or whether this will actually harm them. What we also need to remember that when we call emergency services, they're usually 4, 5, 6 hour delay in them attending, right? Because this person sometimes, maybe they're not in danger now, right? They are just shared that they're in danger. So that is not priority for emergency services. And based on the location and situation and so on, it might take many hours for them to arrive, right? So it's very important as well that you are there with that person. And if you choose to refer them and get them to that support, do that with consent, right? You'll say, okay, let's explore some options. Do you think it would be useful for you to actually go to a safe house, right? Do you believe it would be useful for you to go to GP and have that conversation and explore those options? Do you feel it would be useful for us to speak to a professional, right? And you take action on behalf of that person, because they are most likely will not, right? If they are feeling that way, you say, I'm here for you. We'll do this together. I'll be here with you. Let's do this together. And sometimes just sitting there and being there with that person and saying, I'm here for you, no matter what they go through, is the biggest support that they can do, right? And if they absolutely say no and they really frightened by the thought of that and so on, we really have to be very careful of how exactly we are referring people. In the cases as well, there are, I've worked with some cases where children, for example, who are being abused by their own parents, have reported the situation to, let's say, the teachers then have their duty of care, they report it to social services go and visit the parents, they're prepared for this, they know what to do, and so on, and the child gets the hurt, right? So we sometimes have to really take that responsibility, and in assessing the risks, and the way your role here is to protect the individual, right? And sometimes referring them to those emergency services will do harm. Sometimes it is the right thing to do. And we have to explore those options and be open. And it's for you to make that call. But remember that your role is to protect this individual. And you want to stay with them until you feel like they are in a safe place. And of course, if this is, if it's a friend and so on, of course, you can stay with them for days and whatever it needs to be, right? But if this is your colleague, if this is a work conversation, of course, you will not be able to do that. So you want to find a person who can be there for them. Say, who is the close person, your relative, and so on, that I can call I'll do that. You don't need to do that. That I can tell them the situation that you are in, so they can just stay with you, just be there next to you, right? That's all what you want to do. And the best thing that you can do to protect that person is just to make sure that they're not alone and they always have a person with them, right? And that doesn't always have to be an emergency service. It could be their partner, it could be their mother, it could be their colleague, it could be their friend, it could be whatever, right? Having person next to you will protect them from doing this.
Absolutely. And I think just useful highlighting with that, the kind of the only time that we would say definitely do contact emergency services is if you have really good reason to believe that the suicide is in progress, that something has already begun and the suicide is already in progress, it's happening.
And this is especially when you are not with that person in person, right? So if somebody message you, goodbye messages and those things, and you call them and they don't answer, if you cannot physically be there with that person, absolutely you would call emergency services, because you cannot be there to protect that person, right? But if you are there in person, it is definitely then, it's a different way of assessing how you can protect that person yourself first, or, through other supports available. And here is also one very important, interesting and shocking stat. When do you think the person is most likely to take their own life? Do you know, Valentina, that statistic?
So I think this is when it's, if I'm correct, in that when they've just been released from care.
Absolutely. So this is within 6 weeks of them being released from psychiatric hospital, essentially from the care, right? So you think about those institutions that are supposed to be designed to protect, to help person to recover, but sometimes that experience is so shocking and it's so dehumanizing that as soon as the person feels that they are out of there, they are end up being in a very vulnerable place, right? So also consider this, that if you have some loved ones who go through the treatment, who go through that, they are in a very vulnerable place as soon as they go back into life and face that reality and so on. So yeah, so any other questions, anything else we can address, anything else we can answer before anything else we've missed, Valentina? I'm just trying to think.
I think we've covered everything that we can cover in this time. If any other things come up, then we'll put links to resources in the comments. Like I said, I'm going to mention Grassroots Suicide Prevention again. Really fantastic resource just for kind of your own learning as an individual, but also for the training that they deliver. There's quite a lot of different options in terms of the intensity and the time commitment. So if you're kind of unsure of where to go, it's to learn more. It's a really useful place.
And if you would like some more support for your organization, we do deliver these type of workshops for organizations, and we use CLAMP model to train mental health first aiders, to train ambassadors, to have those conversations, line managers. We believe that everyone should have that training, right? Very often companies are only asking this to be delivered for for HR and mental health first aiders, but we genuinely believe that everyone should be able to have those difficult, uncomfortable conversations. So we are offering those workshops. Feel free to reach out to us, and we would love to support you with that. So thank you for everyone who's listening. We know this is a huge topic, and we only just scratched the surface, but we just hope that you've taken away that bit of a tool to just for you to feel more comfortable to have those conversations, but most importantly as well, know the impact on yourself of having those conversations. When you're working in the field where you're always taking on other people's burdens on your shoulders, who supports people, so for any of you who are therapists, coaches, counselors, mental health professionals in any way, HR professionals, we do have our own community and academy where we facilitate that support and network, and we provide that support for people who support people. So please feel free to reach out to us for more support, for more resources, more information. And if you are feeling like life is too much for you right now, we'd love to be there for you and find a way to work things through with you. So feel free to reach out to us personally, to me, to Valentina. We are available for this, and we will always be there if we can. We hope you'll have that tiny bit of courage and been inspired by our conversation to just make that tiny step to reach out for that help and conversation with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening and taking the time to kind of educate yourself in this as well. It's protective for you, for your loved ones, for everyone. Thank you.
And thank you, Valentina.
Thank you, Valentina.
Bye.